the passage in Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz concludes with Levi saying, speaking of Hrbinnik, re-articulating that Hrbinnik had no speech to articulate, and finally says Hrbinnik died in March of 1945, and he bears witness through these words of mine. That's where Levi concludes. And with that, and I apologize that we're a bit over time, and I promise you we'll be done by at least 1:30. We move quickly into reading habits. So we talked about the archive. Kaegan was discussing the archive. So the archive, then, a storehouse of knowledge, testifying by its contents, not merely to the said and the unsaid, but to the sayable and the unsayable, or more than that, to the possibility and the impossibility of speech. In working with these materials, and what we've been working with are the video testimonies from the Fortunoff archive, which are at Yale, which is at Yale, we become acquainted with the effort to say that which cannot be said, to speak for those beings, as Levi tried to, that cannot speak, and to speak from within non-speech, we might say. The question then is how to move from merely being an acquaintance to a party. How do we become party to this effort, rather than merely one who is there? And to do this, we turn to the situations in which information is packaged and delivered in these testimonies. We understand the testimonial situation, and I don't know if anyone's seen these, but you can imagine there's survivor, then there's camera, and then you don't see who's behind it, but every now and again they interrupt, and otherwise they give their story. So we have to understand first the testimonial situation to understand the form that the testimony takes. And well, this is all in there, but we'll get there. We understand the testimonial situation to be subject to the conversational framework, this definition of the situation, making certain demands upon its participants, requiring that certain obligations be fulfilled. The most basic and everyday conversation is just turn-taking. I speak, you speak. I don't sit up here and just lecture to you. That would be inappropriate if it were a conversation. Thankfully, it's not, but that would be the conversational framework. Thanks, guys. Within the testimonial situation, which is a subset of that, the witness finds himself or herself in a particular bind, aside from the general obligations that, you guys can move up if you want. Okay. Great. It doesn't feel so empty. Aside from the usual demands that are made upon participants in conversations, we have two added burdens, what I call the peculiar bind of the witness who enters into the testimonial situation. On the one hand, the burden of proof. So this would somehow correlate with a scale of objectivity of being able to provide the details and just the details that they might enter into the archive and provide an objective record of what took place. This, of course, would exclude the survivor's experience while in the camps, because that would be deemed as too subjective, and that's what I meant when I said earlier that we understand testimony to be sufficient neither legally nor historically. There always has to be, as we say, an eyewitness account. So on the one hand, they have to move away from that self who went through this experience, and satisfy the burden of proof that we ask of them. But then there's the problem of the social self, and I think of Primo Levi again in this, who his first book, Survival in Auschwitz as We Know It, published in Italian in 1947, I believe, originally came under the title in Italian that would translate directly to If This Is a Man. It was changed to Survival in Auschwitz when it was published in English because this designation was thought to be more marketable. The point in all of this, from If This Is a Man to Survival in Auschwitz, is what we become party to then, as it were, is the shift from Primo Levi, who is a man who so happens to be a survivor, to the survivor who just so happens to be a man, and he becomes our common symbolic referent who almost ceases to be a man at all, just by a slight emendation of the alphabet. This corresponds to what Irving Goffman, the sociologist, described, this in reference to patients in mental asylums as constituting a state of self-alienating moral servitude, where the survivor in delivering their testimony is asked to somehow give us what we want. We reference this as being the redemptive spirit, the resilience of the spirit, to deliver what we demand. And in this respect, this is where that shift is made, and the social self and the narrative self become concomitant, and we almost lose the person there. So how do I would never say that. How does the witness articulate their experience, maintain themselves as themselves in this particular situation, and at the same time be able to satisfy the burden of proof that is placed upon them by the testimonial framework? In examining these oral narratives, what we are attempting to parse are strategies of narrative construction that are employed for the purpose of successfully navigating that bind that I just articulated, and of satisfying those manifold burdens placed upon the witness by the exceptionally dense framework, conversation, interview, testimony, Holocaust, into which he or she enters. One question that we might ask, and I'll move through this quickly, is why narrative? Why look at narrative when there are so many other forms, or so many other modes, as it were, of recapitulating past experience? The first, admittedly, is strictly methodological or analytical. Narrative is, at least in its ideal type, is fairly well-formed. It's well understood. It has a well-articulated structure. So not only does this allow us for a good deal of analytical consistency, if not a consistency of terms, although we have that, at least a consistency of how we look at it in a segmented way. But it also, through this, allows us to accurately look at patterns of syntactic and lexical operations. More important than any of this is because it can be a well-articulated structure, we know where the witness deviates from that structure. And that's where we can start to look at the strategies of narrative construction, the way in which it is actually put together, when the structure moves away from the ideal, from the well-formed, and takes on a different look. This gives us first insight into the exigencies of the situation, which I already talked about. And the only one I want to touch upon is what William Labov, a linguist who's actually in the Penn Linguistics department, refers to as the reportability paradox. So reportability in everyday conversation, we can well know it, but just to say it has to do with appropriateness to the situation. What would I speak of around my friend? What would I speak of with my mother? Is it appropriate to the situation in which it occurs? Is it appropriate in another sense? Does it fit into the flow of the conversation? Is it relevant? Before all of this and other factors that contribute to reportability, it's a matter of whether or not the narrative is extraordinary, whether or not it deviates from the expected sequence of events. There's always a story, of course, but there's not always a story to tell. There's only a story to tell if it's unexpected, if it deviates from the norm. The problem here is that the more reportable the event becomes, the more it deviates from the norm, the less believable it might be. And so this is the reportability paradox, the inverse relationship between reportability and credibility. You can imagine that reportability tends to be at the very high end in testimonies about experience in the death camps, whereas credibility is always at issue because it is so extreme. And this is where we have to look at the scale of objectivity, which we see in the offering of evidence, the shift from first to third person knowledge. The question being, at what point does our skepticism about extremity, about these extreme things that are being reported, turn into belief? And it's this tension between reportability and credibility that ultimately drives the narrative forward. And the way it drives it forward is as a personal theory of causation. We demand that one thing connect to another because that's what makes it believable, which is difficult in the camps where everything was more or less by chance. You went to the right or you went to the left, or to the right or to the left, depending on the whim, the time of day, the time of year, whether or not you could speak the language, whether or not someone was in a good or a bad mood. So it would seem to go against the grain of the actual experience, and I'll just note on the side that this might account perhaps for the resistance that many witnesses show for actually organizing their narratives into a causal sequence, which makes it difficult to analyze as well because a narrative is a sequence of clauses that have to occur in a certain order. So what do we do with that when they attempt to actually not give a narrative, when they attempt to not sequence